You may think the life of a pharaoh was filled with endless luxury, golden thrones, banquets, and adoration. But the truth is far more ordinary and far heavier. Every step they took, from the way they washed their hands in the morning, to the food they ate at the royal table, carried the weight of the gods and the fate of Egypt itself. In this story, you'll walk slowly through the palace halls, hear the quiet rituals at dawn, and sit beside the pharaoh as he eats bread and honey while the kingdom watches. It may seem boring, but within these details lies the burden of ruling, as both man and God. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let us uncover the boring secrets of the pharaoh's daily life and the unseen cost of wearing the double crown. Chapter 1. Awakening in the Palace, Pharaoh's Morning Rituals. If you try to imagine the start of a pharaoh's day, you might picture gold-plated chambers, loud fanfare, and servants rushing about in a frenzy. But in truth, the mornings of ancient Egyptian kings were not about noise and spectacle. They were about rhythm, order, and ritual. A slow beginning in a world where even the act of waking up carried meaning. The pharaoh was not simply a man who had slept in a bed. He was considered the earthly embodiment of Horus, the living god of kingship. This meant that his morning was not entirely his own. It belonged, first and foremost, to the state, to the gods, and to the hundreds of officials who worked to ensure that he embodied divine order, what Egyptians called Mat. The palace awakens. The royal palace in the early hours would not have been noisy. Ancient Egyptian mornings were shaped by the climate. The air was cooler, the desert winds softer, the light of the rising sun streaming into the palace courtyards long before the streets of Thebes or Memphis fully stirred. Within the thick mud brick walls, there was silence broken only by the footsteps of servants. The pharaoh himself, though revered as a god, lived in rooms not vastly different in structure from the wealthy nobles of his time. The chambers were large but not cavernous, the walls whitewashed or painted with faint symbolic designs, the floors made of packed clay, sometimes covered with reed mats. At night, oil lamps would have burned softly, giving the space a golden glow. By morning, their flames had dwindled, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke mixed with incense from the previous evening. His bed, not the towering golden spectacle often imagined from tomb art, was usually a wooden frame, slightly raised with woven cords supporting a mattress stuffed with reeds or straw. Cushions of linen provided some comfort, but even the pharaoh's rest was more functional than luxurious. Sheets of fine linen, cooled by the night air, would have been draped lightly over him. When the first rays of sunlight entered the room, it was a signal that the palace day must begin. The pharaoh's attendants, often eunuchs or trusted servants, approached carefully. They would begin with silence, ensuring that the Great One's awakening was not abrupt. To wake a pharaoh was not the same as waking an ordinary man. It had to be done with reverence, as though one were tending to the rising sun itself. Ritual cleansing before the day. Once awake, the pharaoh's first duty was not to eat or speak, but to purify. Cleanliness was not just about hygiene in Egypt. It was about preparing the body to act as a vessel of divine order. Servants brought cool water in alabaster jars, drawn from wells or carried from the river the day before. The pharaoh would wash, sometimes assisted by attendants, using natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt, or scented oils to cleanse the skin. His teeth, too, might be rubbed with twigs or pastes made from crushed herbs, though dental hygiene was always a challenge. In Egypt, where coarse bread wore down teeth rapidly, priests sometimes oversaw these first acts of purification. They might chant quiet prayers as water was poured over the pharaoh's hands. The ritual mirrored the washing of statues of gods in temples. Just as the divine images had to be cleansed daily, so too did the king who embodied them after washing. The pharaoh's skin was anointed with oils, lotus oil, cedar oil, or myrrh. These were not just perfumes, but preservatives of health, keeping the skin supple against the dry climate. To smell fragrant was not indulgence but duty. Scent was linked with purity, and purity was the foundation of order. Dressing the living god, dressing was another slow, deliberate process. A pharaoh did not simply choose a robe at random. His clothing reflected his role as ruler, priest, and warrior. The first garment was usually a fine linen kilt, pleated with careful precision. Linen was Egypt's pride, light, airy, woven in countless qualities from rough to nearly transparent. A pharaoh's linen was, of course, the finest available, smooth to the touch and whitened by hours of pounding and washing. Over this base garment, he might wear additional linens, belts, or decorative sashes, depending on the occasion of the day. But one of the most important parts of this ritual was the donning of symbolic regalia. While not all crowns and ornaments were worn at once, those were mostly reserved for ceremonies. There were still key items to signify kingship. Sometimes a simple headdress, or a uraeus, the coiled cobra emblem of royal power, would be placed upon the brow. In other cases, only an amulet, perhaps in the shape of an ankh or scarab, would hang discreetly against his chest. Jewelry was common, not purely decorative but protective. Amulets were chosen for their magical properties. A carnelian stone for vitality, turquoise for health, lapis lazuli for connection with the heavens. To wear them was not vanity, but a layer of unseen armor. The first meal that wasn't quite breakfast. By the time the pharaoh was dressed, the palace was fully awake. Courtiers, scribes, and guards had begun their duties, moving like clockwork through corridors and courtyards. The first offerings of the day were being prepared in the temple, trays of bread, beer, fruit, and meat for the gods, though much of this food would later be redistributed to priests and workers. For the pharaoh, however, the morning meal was modest. Egyptians generally ate twice a day, once in the late morning and once in the evening. The early hours were not for feasting, but for prayer and preparation. Still, some light refreshment was offered, perhaps a small piece of bread made from emmer wheat or figs or dates. Beer, a staple for all Egyptians, might be served, though diluted. It was not the food itself that mattered in these hours, but the symbolism of taking sustenance as a divine act, like Ra, the sun god, drawing strength to cross the sky, preparing. For audience, once purified, dressed, and lightly sustained, the pharaoh did not retreat into privacy. His mornings were soon filled with obligation. Officials would gather to present reports. Scribes brought scrolls recording harvests, taxation, and temple accounts. Military leaders awaited commands, and priests sought approval for rituals. But before stepping into this web of governance, the pharaoh's first act was usually religious. He had to make offerings at the temple, either in person or by proxy. This ritual affirmed his role as the intermediary between gods and men. Without his morning devotion, the cosmic balance, Mat, was believed to falter. It was a curious burden. The pharaoh was a man waking from sleep, stretching his limbs, like any other. Yet at the same time, he was the pillar upon which the universe rested. His yawn, his washing, his first sip of water, each act was more than personal habit. It was tied into the rhythm of Egypt itself, the weight of routine. It is easy to imagine grandeur in all this, but the truth is that for the pharaoh, these rituals were repetitive. Day after day, year after year, the mornings unfolded in the same way. To us, it may feel dull, almost monotonous. To the Egyptians, this monotony was sacred. The world continued because the same acts were performed without fail. The palace might have echoed with the sounds of sandals on stone floors, of linen rustling, of water poured from jars, but never with laughter or idleness. The pharaoh's morning was not his own. It was a script written by tradition, carried out with precision, and observed by dozens of eyes. And as the morning sun rose higher, the question lingered. Was the pharaoh, in those quiet first moments after sleep, ever able to feel like a man? Or was he always only a god in human form, bound to ceremony? Chapter 2. The Weight of Ceremony. Priests, ritual purification, and daily offerings. The pharaoh's mornings did not end with his dressing or his first taste of bread and figs. What followed was in many ways more important, more binding, and more repetitive than even his political duties. After all, the Egyptians believed that their king's greatest role was not as a warrior or an administrator, but as a priest, the high priest of every temple in the two lands. To be pharaoh meant carrying the burden of worship not as a personal devotion, but as the heartbeat of the nation. Without his offerings, without his ritual cleansing, without his daily presence before the gods, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, and the entire order of the cosmos, Mat, might collapse into chaos. The priests who stood in the pharaoh's shadow. Although the pharaoh was formally the high priest of every temple, he could not physically attend to each shrine across Egypt. Instead, he delegated the practical rituals to a vast network of priests. These men, and sometimes women, lived lives defined by discipline, cleanliness, and endless repetition. The priests rose even earlier than the pharaoh himself. Before entering the sacred precincts, they shaved their bodies entirely, head to toe, to prevent impurity. They bathed multiple times each day, scrubbing themselves with natron salts and cool water. Their garments, too, were strictly linen, white, plain, and unadorned, representing purity and simplicity before the gods. Only after these acts of cleansing could they step into the temple courts, where they became extensions of the pharaoh's own divine role. It was their hands that washed the statues of gods, their lips that recited the daily hymns, and their labor that kept the endless cycle of offerings moving like the steady flow of the Nile. But every act they performed was not for themselves. It was said to be done on behalf of the king. The pharaoh's spirit was present in each ritual, whether he stood physically in the temple or remained in his palace miles away. The morning purification of the gods, while the pharaoh was being cleansed and anointed in his chambers, priests were engaged in a parallel ritual at the temple. The sacred statues of the gods, hidden away in the innermost sanctuaries, were awakened just as the pharaoh had been. The process was slow and methodical. First, the sanctuary was opened, often after reciting protective incantations. The god's image, usually carved from wood and inlaid with gold or precious stones, was revealed. To the Egyptians, these statues were not symbols but living embodiments of the gods themselves. They required the same care, the same washing, the same feeding as any being. The priests carefully removed the wrappings or coverings that had protected the statue overnight. They then washed it with water, anointed it with oils, and clothed it in fresh linen. Perfumes were applied and new jewelry placed upon its form. Only after this renewal could the god live another day, shining as a beacon of order. It is easy to think of these acts as theatrical, but to the Egyptians, they were deeply real. If the statue was neglected, the god might withdraw, and Egypt would be left vulnerable. The divine had to be cared for, sustained, and continually renewed, just as humans themselves needed food and water. Offerings of bread, beer, and meat. The most visible part of these morning ceremonies was the offering of food. Trays of bread, cakes, roasted meats, vegetables, and fruit were laid before the gods. Beer and wine were poured into jars, their fragrance filling the air. But of course the gods did not literally consume the offerings. What mattered was the essence, the unseen life force of the food, which was believed to be absorbed by the deity. Once this essence had been taken, the food was considered ritually transformed. It was no longer divine sustenance, but it was far from wasted. The redistributed offerings, known as reversion offerings, were carried back out of the temple. They became meals for the priests, workers, and sometimes the poor. In this way, the act of feeding the gods also fed the people. It was a circulation of life, flowing outward from the temple, just as the Nile's waters spread across the fields. The pharaoh's role in this cycle was central. Even if he never touched the food, it was given in his name. The inscriptions were clear. It was the king who fed the gods, the king who sustained Egypt, the king whose devotion ensured that offerings never ceased, the pharaoh as intercessor. In many of these rituals, the pharaoh might only appear symbolically. Yet on certain days, festivals, ceremonies, or moments of crisis, he would personally lead the offerings. Imagine the scene: the ruler of Egypt, clad in white linen, carrying a tray of bread or pouring a libation of beer before the shrine. Silence of the temple would be profound. No chatter, no murmurs, only the sound of footsteps echoing against stone columns painted with bright colors, or the faint rustle of linen garments in the stillness. This silence mattered. It separated the temple from the noisy bustle of the outside world. Here, time itself slowed. The pharaoh's gestures were deliberate, each one echoing the cosmic gestures of creation. To lift bread to a god was to repeat the act of the first, offering at the dawn of the universe. To pour beer was to refresh the gods as the waters of Nun. The primordial chaos once refreshed creation. The pharaoh, then, was not only king but also cosmic intercessor. His role was heavy not because of spectacle, but because of repetition. Day after day, year after year, he bore the responsibility of performing, or at least authorizing, these acts of renewal. Boredom as order, it may seem monotonous. Every morning, the same washing of statues, the same presentation of food, the same words of prayer spoken in hushed tones. But to the Egyptians, this monotony was not tedious. It was necessary. The universe was fragile. Without daily attention, it would fall apart. Chaos, Isfet, always lurked at the edges, threatening to break into the ordered world. By repeating the same rituals without fail, Egypt's priests and pharaoh ensured stability. To us, it might feel almost bureaucratic, like paperwork repeated endlessly. Yet bureaucracy itself was sacred in Egypt, just as scribes filled their papyrus scrolls with careful lists and accounts. So too did priests fill each day with ritual, line by line, offering by offering. The sameness was security. The boredom was safety, the pharaoh's burden when the pharaoh returned from temple. Rituals, or when reports of the rituals were brought to him, his day was only beginning. He still faced matters of state, of war, of economy. But in truth, nothing weighed heavier than this religious duty. For in the Egyptian view, a failed battle could be mended, a failed harvest could be survived, but a failed ritual? That could mean the unraveling of the world. One wonders how the pharaoh himself felt in these hours. Did he, like his priests, ever tire of the endless cycle? Did he ever wake, wash, dress, and feel the weight of knowing that every action, no matter how small, was not private but cosmic? It is a thought that lingers. Did the pharaoh ever crave a morning without ceremony? A day when he could wake not as a god, but simply as a man? Chapter 3. The Pharaoh's Table. Food, leisure, and the unseen burden of daily life. By the time the morning rituals were complete, the ablutions performed, the gods fed, and the silence of the temples broken by the faint rustle of linen garments. Returning to the streets, the pharaoh's own body required attention. The first true meal of the day was not hurried but deliberate, another act embedded within the framework of order. Eating, like worship, was never a private act. It was a continuation of his role as both man and god. The pharaoh's table. The pharaoh's meals were not like those of ordinary Egyptians, though they reflected the same staples that nourished every household along the Nile. Bread was the heart of the diet, dense, coarse loaves made from emmer wheat, often flavored with honey or dates. Beer, brewed from barley, foamed in wide-mouthed jars, cloudy and thick with grains. But unlike the loaves baked in clay ovens by common families, the pharaoh's bread was prepared by teams of bakers who served within the palace kitchens. The Offerings made to the gods earlier that morning often reappeared here. The reversion offerings, meats, cakes, and fruits, returned to the royal household, redistributed through the palace staff, and presented anew at the pharaoh's table. In this way, the king's meal was tied directly to divine sustenance. Meat, though rare for most Egyptians, was abundant for the pharaoh. Cuts of beef and mutton roasted on spits, while poultry, ducks, geese, pigeons appeared regularly. Fish from the Nile, though plentiful, carried less prestige than land animals, yet they were still present, grilled or stewed with onions. And herbs, wine, imported from the Delta vineyards or from beyond Egypt's borders, was poured into delicate cups. Honey cakes, figs, and pomegranates offered sweetness at the end of a meal. The pharaoh, unlike the farmer or the craftsman, did not know hunger, but he did know ritual. Even food was structured, portioned, and chosen to symbolize abundance. And divine favor, dining as ceremony, meals were rarely solitary. The pharaoh dined in the presence of attendants, family, and often officials who brought news and petitions while he ate. The act of eating was as much about being observed as it was about nourishment. To watch the pharaoh consume food was to witness order maintained. Each bite of bread, each sip of beer or wine, was symbolic of Egypt itself being sustained. When he ate, so too did the kingdom. Imagine the stillness of those meals. Courtiers standing at respectful distances, scribes waiting to record decisions, fan-bearers moving gently to keep flies away. The air was filled with the scent of roasted meat, perfumed oils, and the faint sweetness of honey. Yet beneath it all was the quiet awareness that this meal was a performance. The pharaoh's appetite was not private hunger, but a public act of balance. Leisure in the palace, after the rituals and meals, the pharaoh's day shifted toward governance. Councils, petitions, and decrees, but also toward leisure. For leisure was not wasted time in Egypt. It was another aspect of divine kinship. The pharaoh might retire to a shaded garden within the palace walls. Pools filled with lotus flowers shimmered under the midday sun, their petals open and wide, releasing fragrance. Ducks swam lazily while palm trees rustled in the faint desert breeze. Here, the pharaoh could hunt birds with a throw stick or watch attendants net fish from the water. Hunting was not only sport, but a symbolic act of maintaining control over nature. Each strike against a bird or fish was another small victory of order over chaos. Music filled these hours too. Harpists, flutists, and singers performed songs in praise of the pharaoh, their melodies rising softly in enclosed courtyards. The rhythms were steady, repetitive, like the pulse of life along the Nile. The pharaoh might sit silently, eyes half closed, absorbing the sounds. For him, relaxation was always linked with symbolism. Even rest was not truly rest, but an affirmation of divine harmony, games of eternity. Leisure also took the form of games. The pharaohs were known to play Senet, an ancient board game whose origin stretched back into Egypt's earliest dynasties. A simple arrangement of squares and carved playing pieces, Senet was far more than amusement. It represented the soul's journey through the afterlife, passing through stages of trial and blessing until reaching eternal peace. To watch the pharaoh move a game piece across the board was to see him rehearse, in miniature, the passage of existence itself. Victory in the game was never simply about chance or skill. It was about affirming that the ruler, in both life and death, would triumph. Other games existed too, hounds and jackals, dice-like activities, but Senet remained central. It was as if even in his leisure, the pharaoh rehearsed his cosmic role, the unseen burden. Beneath the surface of these meals and pastimes, however, lay the quiet weight of expectation. The pharaoh's life was filled with abundance, yet it was not freedom. Every action, eating bread, hunting birds, playing a game, was layered with meaning, observed, recorded, and remembered. A farmer could eat a meal alone in silence, tasting bread and beer for himself alone. The pharaoh could not. Each swallow was a statement. A craftsman could play a game to pass the evening. The pharaoh's games were reminders of eternity. To rule as pharaoh was to live without privacy. The unseen burden was not the golden crowns or jeweled staffs, but the knowledge that nothing was merely ordinary. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a mirror of cosmic order. The evening descent. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Nile, the pharaoh's duties shifted again. Evening rituals awaited, prayers. At sunset, and the endless rhythm of governance continued. But the day, shaped by ritual meals and structured leisure, carried a lesson. The pharaoh's life was not his own. His body, his time, even his appetite, belonged to Egypt and to the gods. And so, as the sun dipped and the air cooled, one cannot help but wonder, in the quiet of his chamber, when attendants withdrew and the palace dimmed into silence, did the pharaoh ever feel the weight of solitude? Did he ever sit before an untouched meal, hearing only the sound of his own breath, and long to eat or rest as a man rather than a god? Thank you for spending your time here with me, drifting through another quiet piece of history. If this video helped you relax or kept you company as you fell asleep, I'd be so grateful if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small way of supporting what I do, and it helps me bring you more calming stories from the past. This is Quiet Boring Sleep, wishing you peace, rest, and gentle dreams tonight. Until next time, good night.